Taiwan is bracing for increasing international pressure as Beijing is set to intensify efforts to sway the island's remaining diplomatic allies. And this comes as President William Lai follows in the footsteps of his predecessor by disregarding the One China policy. Beijing has ramped up its efforts to woo Taiwan's diplomatic allies since Mr. Lai's independence-leaning party first took power in 2000. But Taiwan's international isolation began even before that.
It started 53 years ago with the removal of the Republic of China, Taiwan's official name, from the United Nations. Soon, friends began ditching Taiwan one by one. Japan switched its recognition to the People's Republic of China in 1972. 7 years later, the United States did the same. And Taiwan's pool of friends keeps shrinking. The One China policy means no government can maintain formal diplomatic ties with both China and Taiwan. For many, switching sides makes monetary sense. Both China and Taiwan have engaged in so-called dollar diplomacy, enticing swing nations with financial rewards. But as China's economic might grows in the last 4 decades, Taiwan is fighting a seemingly losing battle. And since the pro-independence Democratic Progressive Party came to power in 2000, it was hit by defeat after defeat. 9 countries, including Liberia, Chad, and Costa Rica, ditched Taiwan for China between 2002 and 2008, when Chen Shui-bian was president. And during the 8 years since 2016, when President Tsai Ing-wen was in office, another 10 allies left Taiwan, including Panama, El Salvador, and Honduras. As Taiwan witnesses its 3rd DPP president, there are only 12 countries in the world that still call Taiwan friend.
For more, let's bring in Victoria Jen in Taiwan and Livia Xiong in Beijing to talk more about this. Victoria, Taiwan's diplomatic landscape has shifted with a focus on maintaining relations with its remaining 12 allies. So tell us more about these allies and their strategic and economic importance for Taiwan.
Yes. Except for Paraguay and Guatemala and Holy See, most of the remaining diplomatic allies for Taiwan are small countries in the Pacific Ocean, as well as Latin America, such as Belize, the Marshall Islands, and Palau. Now, Palau, for example, is one of the smallest countries in the world, with only 20,000 residents. And even though it's small, it doesn't hold much sway politically or economically, but it does play a vital role in providing Taiwan a voice in the international community, such as the UN. And also their recognition of Taiwan as a country also help undermine Beijing's sovereign claim over the island.
Now, Olivia, I'm curious to know whether Beijing's response, do you think, would have been any different had that been a different leader at the helm?
I'll tell you that is an interesting question, and one that I also pose to experts, because just 2 days after Mr. Lai's election, when he won the presidential race, we saw the tiny Pacific nation of Nauru announce that it was going to cut diplomatic ties with Taipei in favor of Beijing, and Taipei responding to that, saying that the timing of this announcement was intentionally planned by the mainland to coincide soon after the election, and Beijing, of course, welcoming the move as well. And analysts I spoke to said that it would take time to pull off such a move, but the fact that it was timed just after the election results were made known was a signal from Beijing of its displeasure for the independence-leaning DPP and for William Lai. Whether it would have been different with another leader, observers I've spoken to say that would be difficult to predict. But we do have to remember that what China is offering to Taiwan's remaining allies are economic incentives, which these countries need. They are looking for support for its development. And Vic, just to ask you here, besides economic incentives, could you talk us through what kind of economic pressure Beijing has been putting on Taipei's remaining diplomatic allies?
Well, for Palau, for instance, that it has suffered a loss of Chinese mainland visitors to Palau because it reportedly rejected Beijing's demand to cut ties with Taiwan. Now, in its peak in 2015, Palau welcomed more than 163,000 foreign visitors, and about half of them were Chinese visitors. But in 2017, China banned its tour groups to Palau, and that has caused the number to plunge by nearly half. And that is devastating to the Palau's tourism, which accounts for 40% of its GDP. And now the ban is still in place as we speak.
So, despite Taiwan's dwindling number of diplomatic allies, its position on the international stage remains a contentious issue. And China's Foreign Affairs Minister Wang Yi previously indicated that China will not stop its efforts to further isolate Taiwan.
如果现在还有人纵容支持台独，那就是挑战中国的主权。如果个别国家执意与台湾地区保持官方关系，那就是干涉中国的内政。我相信大家迟早会看到一张国际社会遵守一中原则的全家福的照片，这只是一个时间问题。
Olivia, some say that the number of diplomatic allies Taiwan has, all of 12, doesn't necessarily reflect the full picture on the ground. Can you just elaborate more on that?
Well, I think clearly we can see that from Beijing's response to William Lai's inauguration has shown that it is increasingly concerned about his desire to want to build deeper ties with the international community. And so we have seen Chinese officials, including the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, emphasize how there are many countries and that most countries in the world support the one China principle, but also they have continued to hit out at the countries that did send delegations, including the U.S., which sent an unofficial delegation to Mr. Lai's inauguration, adding that it's firmly opposed to any form of official exchanges. But, you know, that hasn't stopped countries, even though they may not have official diplomatic ties with Taiwan, from building its relationship with Taipei. And one of those key relationships that Beijing has been angered by is Taipei's relationship with the U.S. Even though Washington doesn't have official diplomatic ties, it's talked about this, quote, robust unofficial relationship. And we have seen previously U.S. President Joe Biden talking about how America will defend Taiwan in the event that China invades the island, which has angered Beijing and seeming to deviate from the U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity, even though U.S. officials later clarified that there has been no change in its position. And what's also angered Beijing is beyond the support from the U.S. is also Taiwan seeing support from U.S. partners like Japan. Mr. Lai also saying that any threat posed to Taiwan would affect Japan as well. Ateli.
Now, Victoria, we talked about economic incentives a little earlier, and Taiwan, as a matter of fact, has attacked China for engaging in so-called dollar diplomacy. What are its plans to address those tactics?
Well, basically, Taiwan is not going to engage in China's dollar diplomacy simply because it does not have the economic might of its rival. And so Taiwan hopes to maintain its diplomatic allies through shared democratic values and also technical assistance. Now, at the same time, Taiwan is hoping to build more partnerships with Western countries, and such a relationship is expected to be more substantive, provide more substantive assistance to Taiwan compared to the other diplomatic allies. For instance, Taiwan and the U.S. do not have diplomatic relations, but they are actually have the very close ties, and they are actually at their strongest level. So Taiwan is hoping that it can build more such ties with other countries in order to fend off China's political pressure. And Ali, I have a question for you. How is the rest of the world viewing and responding to Beijing's diplomatic pressure on Taiwan?
Well, Vic, as we have been talking about that Taiwan's remaining diplomatic allies largely remain in the Pacific, and the region has become a battleground for where we have seen this geopolitical tussle between China and the U.S. really play out. Now, this war of words that we have seen between China and the U.S., we saw where Nauru switched its diplomatic allegiance from Taipei to Beijing, as we were talking about earlier. The U.S. weighing in on that situation at that time, saying that China, quote, often makes promises in exchange for diplomatic relations that says ultimately remain unfulfilled. Beijing, of course, hitting back at this, saying that the U.S. was interfering in its internal affairs, and this was a breach of the One China principle. But going beyond that, as China has stepped up its engagement of the Pacific, which has translated to influence, we have also seen the U.S. and its partners step up its engagement in the Pacific. This also, as there have been concerns among the Pacific's traditional partners, which besides the U.S. include Australia and New Zealand, these concerns revolving around security and defense interests, especially as in 2022, we saw the Solomon Islands sign a deal with China to boost cooperation on law enforcement and security matters. So we have seen attempts by the U.S. and its partners to engage the Pacific more. Australia's Deputy Prime Minister, in fact, is now on a visit to the Solomon Islands, pledging support in healthcare and border control. Earlier this year, also after months of delay, we saw the U.S. approve billions of dollars in funding to Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and Palau in a show of American commitment, pledging a slew of benefits and support. But also remember that the U.S., under this agreement, is able to use the regions for their military exercises and installations. And as the overall China-U.S. rivalry is expected to continue down the road, so is the geopolitical tussle is expected to continue in the Pacific region.
And of course, we'll bring you more as this unfolds. Thanks so very much, Victoria Jen in Taiwan and Olivia Seong in Beijing.